request. So when she goes to do her request, that'll be lovely. Her receipts are just.
Right? And there are many ways that we can see difference, and that could be race and ethnicity and gender, but it can also be religion and language and ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geographic region, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And depending on the institution, they might be more interested in certain areas, right? So for example, a predominantly white institution might be really focused on bringing in more racial and ethnic diversity. An institution that is located in a particular part of the country that maybe has, for example, I would say Stony Brook. We know that Stony Brook is located near the Shinnecock Bay, right? And we know that they're in, my words are slipping me this morning, forgive me. So we know that we have individuals that are from the Native community that are living close by, but we don't see that reflected in our student body. And so for Stony Brook might say, well, we're looking to increase the number of Native students that are attending our institution. So depending on the institution, the focus of diversity for that institution might be different. But as you're thinking about writing your statement, you want to think about what areas of diversity do you want to focus on as someone who would be contributing to DEI. So in addition to diversity, we have equity. And equity now takes it a step further, and it's really looking at structural issues, structural barriers. And these could include racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on, that have prevented the participation of individuals from marginalized groups. And so when we talk about equity, equity can sometimes be conflated with equality. But there really are two different things. For example, equality would be, I gave everyone in the room a pair of shoes, right? Everyone got the same thing. But equity would mean I gave everyone a pair of shoes that is in your own size. It makes no sense for me to give you a pair of shoes that are not in your size because you can't use them, right? And so everyone doesn't need the same thing. And when we talk about equity, we're talking about what do individuals need in order to fully participate. Then there's inclusion, which is a proactive effort through actions, programs, policies to ensure that everyone feels welcome, respected, supported, and valued. We know from the student services literature that this is really important. Students who experience a sense of belonging and feeling welcome have much better outcomes than students who are in institutions, programs, what have you, where they don't feel a sense of inclusion. And this is something that is really important that institutions are looking at in order to ensure that every student is able to experience a sense of belonging. So as you think about your statement, you want to think about your own professional values as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why do you think it's valuable? And how about in your discipline specifically? Are there aspects of diversity that are missing from your discipline? And how might you or your efforts contribute to changing that? And also, what kinds of student, staff, faculty, et cetera, diversity are you thinking about as you're answering the question, and how and the ways in which diversity manifests in various campus communities that might be valuable for you to consider? So there are many, many, many areas that you can think about, and you really don't need to talk about all of them. But as you think about your own personal values and you think about how you want to contribute within a higher education institution throughout your career, you really want to start to think about what you want to hone in on as it pertains to these areas. So I'm going to put this picture up, and I'm going to ask you in the chat to tell me what you see in this picture. Or if you want to raise your hand and come off mute, you can do so as well. So what do you notice in this photo?
It looks like Frankie has a hand up.
Go ahead, Frankie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it, like the same thing doesn't work for everyone. So like the single box, will let somebody have access to the environment, but not everyone. And so like people's needs are different.
Yes, thank you for that. I see your comment also, Aya, in the chat, equality, equity versus inclusion. And this is true. So as we look at this and we start to talk about the various terms that were just defined, we see diversity in the photo. Each of these photos has diversity. There are different people in the photos. There's difference among them, right? And in the first photo, everyone has the same thing. That's equality. Everyone has the same thing, but does everyone need the same thing is the question, right? The first person in the photo, whether there's a box there or not, they can still see the game, right? So did they need the box to stand on? Maybe doesn't seem so, right? Then there's the person in the middle where the box is just the right height for them to be able to see over the fence, right? But for the one on the right, the third person, unfortunately, they're not able to see in that first picture. But then when we look at the second picture, we see one person without the box, the other one with one, and the other one with the two boxes. So now everyone can see the game. But what we really want to see is that third photo where the barrier is removed completely. So there is no need for additional assistance because there's nothing blocking any of the individuals from seeing it. So let me see what you say, Frankie. Yes, yes, I agree. All right, so this, as you think about these terms, hopefully this photo will help you to think about how you're defining the terms. All right. So let's dig deeper into our statement. Let's get started. So the first question you want to ask yourself, once you've thought about how you're defining the terms, you want to think about what elements of your identity inform your teaching, research, or scholarship in a tangible way. Because this will allow you now to dig into your own experience or really your why. And this is where you have an opportunity to show authenticity because your why should be connected to your commitment, right? And so as you think about your identity and how it impacts your teaching, research, and scholarship, now you can really dig into how your values, commitments, and capabilities identify or connect to your identity. And it doesn't mean that if you are not from a marginalized community or if you've had privilege that you're not able to write a strong statement. It's quite possible to write a strong statement even if you don't have a marginalized identity, but even in your own identity, how do you then connect to these issues and how can you put that in your statement? And how do these issues actually shape or your commitment and values as it pertains to these issues connect back to your work? Ultimately, everything needs to connect back to your work. So how do you define diversity? That's where you want to start with your statement, right? And you should be diverse in your view of diversity. So there are the physical characteristics, which are very important, but also there are diversity in viewpoints and abilities and other things that you also want to consider as you're defining diversity. So be really, really clear at the outset of your statement as to how you're defining diversity. And provided here on this slide is an example of how someone might define diversity in their statement. So I'm just going to read it. Our mission as educators is to teach and guide a diverse body of students, regardless of students' ethnic, cultural, racial, and sexual identities. And then it goes into a vision of diversity based on two principles. One, being sensitive to the differences in students' diverse backgrounds and obstacles that might stem from those differences, and also promoting oneness as a collective community for our campus community and close the cultural gap between majority and minority students, faculty, and staff. A sense of collective community can significantly improve everyone's sense of belongingness. So it's indicating here that we're talking about the differences in students' backgrounds, obstacles that come from those differences, and then how we need to work together to promote community so that everyone feels a sense of belonging. So this is a very clear statement as to how this individual is looking at diversity and how they want to define it as it pertains to their work and their scholarship. So now, what's your story, right? What is your story? What obstacles have you had to overcome to get where you are? And this is a place where you don't have to be afraid to acknowledge privilege, right? So if you recognize that in your experience, there are certain privileges that you had that others didn't, it's okay to acknowledge that because that can drive your commitment to ensure that others have opportunities as well. On the flip side, if there were major obstacles that you had to overcome in order to get where you are, and now you want, that drives your passion for helping others, that's a perfect thing for you to focus on as you think about your story. So you could, as we talk about getting personal, you can write about your own experiences of privilege and oppression, but you don't have to get too personal. In other words, you don't have to tell your whole life story as you're trying to express your experience. You can keep it more focused on statistics and studies if you're not comfortable getting too personal. But I do recommend that if you have a personal experience that you can write about, it really does help to strengthen your statement. Either way, whether it's your own story or just looking at studies or statistics, you can show through your statement how you might empathize with students and faculty and staff who have to confront challenges on their way to achieving their educational and professional goals. So as you think about your story and your why and what's driving your commitment and your passion for the work that you do, then we move on to thinking about what are some of the specific things that you've done that connect to your values, right? And if you haven't done anything yet, now is the time to start, and there's plenty of opportunities to do so. Whether it's becoming a mentor or a tutor or getting involved in activities that broaden participation in STEM. The Center for Inclusive Education is focused on supporting students from underrepresented backgrounds as they pursue their training here at Stony Brook. And if you want to get involved with the center, you can reach out to myself or any member of our team. But there are other units on campus that also have individuals who serve as mentors and instructors for various programs and activities. We have the Simon STEM Scholars Program, which is for exceptional undergrads that are pursuing degrees in STEM. We have iSTEM, which is another unit on campus that works with actually K through 12 institutions. And we have our EOP AIM, again, as another program for students who are first gen or from a lower socioeconomic status. And so there are plenty of opportunities right here on our campus for you to get involved if you haven't done anything yet. So I would encourage you to do so and find ways in which you can actually demonstrate your commitment, because a commitment without any demonstration is really hollow and empty, and that will come across. So you definitely want to include that. And if you can't do anything else and you're teaching, at the very least, you can incorporate anti-racist pedagogy. And if you don't know how to do that, you can reach out to the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, and they will help you with that. So there are many workshops on campus about this. And so they can definitely help you to incorporate anti-racist pedagogy in your courses. So there are other programs that I mentioned, LSAMP, C-STEP, WISE, McNair Scholars Program. these programs are federally funded or state funded programs that you can get involved with. And you can either talk about them as someone who has participated in those programs, or you can talk about them as someone who served as a mentor or an advisor to a participant in the program. Most importantly, you want to be able to lay out specific examples of things that you've done so that it's very clear that you've put your commitment into actual action, right? So you want to be able to connect the commitment to the action, to the experience as you're writing your statement. So now, as you talk, after you've talked about what you've done, then you want to talk about what you're going to do. What's your commitment to working towards achieving equity and enhancing diversity? So thinking about the institution that you're going to, in what ways would you be able to demonstrate your commitment through future plans, right? And you want to talk about specific things that you intend to do. It could be a specific component of your teaching that you want to incorporate. It could be that you're intending to write a grant that would serve students from underserved populations. It could be that there's already programs on that campus that you would want to engage with. So let's say you were a McNair student and now that campus has a McNair program, and you might say, well, I'd love to work with, I intend to work with the McNair program, or I intend to work with some other program that's on campus and do outreach in certain ways. So you can think about what you are willing to do and how you're willing to contribute to the pre-existing programs, or you could express an interest in creating a new program once you get to that campus.
Terry, and we have a great question in the chat from Frankie about going back to what you're talking about with including diverse materials in your teaching. Kind of where is the line between how you differentiate your diversity statement with your teaching statement? And Frankie, I don't know if you want to speak to your question any further.
Sure. Because I was just thinking, like, I think for a lot of us, that it's coming through in the way we approach mentorship and also like crafting the syllabus. And to me, that I can't imagine not putting that in my teaching statement, but I also can see that being in the diversity statement. And like, how do we avoid too much overlap or repetition? Would you say the diversity statement should be more about external work that we do, and not so much about the approaching diversity holistically in terms of like the curriculum? Yeah, because I like have trouble sometimes with knowing what goes where.
Yeah, and it is a balance, because when you start sending out your applications, there are going to be institutions where the diversity statement is not included at all. And in those instances, I would say put more of that in your teaching statement and more of that in your research statement. But when you're looking at an institution that's going to require both, then I think there's a balance that you would need to strike between the two of them. You would mention things in both, but you would go more in depth in either statement. So for example, in your teaching statement, you'll go a lot more in depth on pedagogy and the things that you're going to be doing in the classroom. But on your diversity statement, now this is an opportunity to talk about additional activities that you might engage with, such as outreach activities or different types of funding mechanisms that you might consider applying for that are diversity related. So yes, the diversity statement can be more focused on things outside of the teachings if you're going to already include that in your teaching statement. But you wouldn't need to put the same thing in both. You can mention it briefly, but then use your teaching statement to go more in depth with your anti-racist pedagogy and so forth, and specific things that you can do in the classroom. And then use your diversity statement to talk more broadly about your efforts and commitment to diversity. Does that help?
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so as you continue working on your statement, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's really important to customize the statement to the institution that you're writing to. And this is just great practice across the board in all of your materials, whether it's your research statement, your teaching statement, really having an understanding of the type of institution that you're applying to and how that then impacts the work that you would be able to do is important, and that should be reflected in your diversity statement. So for example, is it a land grant institution? Is it an elite institution in an urban setting? Is it an institution that's really focused on engaging a particular community? Is it a Hispanic serving institution, right? So if you're going into an institution that really focuses on a particular area, you want to say what you're going to do as it pertains to the interests and the commitment of that institution. That doesn't mean you're limited to that. It just means you want to connect to that, because one of the things that reviewers are looking for is, are you the right fit for the institution? So if your statement clearly shows that you understand what the institution is and what they're trying to do, then it will speak to your fit for their institution. And then you can incorporate any other thing that is really important to you that you'd like to bring in also as a part of your efforts toward DEI. So definitely look up demographics and definitely just try to really connect what you're doing to that institution so that they can see you as a great fit. So we have a couple of prompts here that you can use as you're thinking about what you'd like to include in your statement. So the first is to think about your past experiences and what you plan to do in the future as it pertains to each of these areas, right? So research and scholarship, mentorship and advising, teaching and service. And again, as we discussed earlier, your research and also your teaching, there needs to be a balance between what you're putting in your research statement and what you're putting in your teaching statement versus what you're putting here. So you can focus on different things in either one of those statements. So as we talk about research and scholarship, first and foremost, does your research address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion directly? Are there things in your work that immediately speak to these topics? Clearly, that would be something to write about in your statement. But you can also think about ways to connect your scholarship to these issues. For example, thinking about genetics, right? And thinking about what's available as it pertains to what we have as it pertains to samples of African-American DNA versus white DNA, and ways in which you might be able to incorporate some of that in your scholarship, right? Does your research and scholarship address issues specific to marginalized groups? Are you working in the medical field? Are there social determinants of health questions that you're trying to answer or look at through your work? How has your work been shared with community or public in a way that promotes access to scholarship? And has your scholarship involved collaboration with diverse groups of colleagues or commentators? So who are your stakeholders? Who are your partners? Who are the people you're working with? Are you working with diverse groups? Are you trying to disseminate to diverse groups? Are you looking at ways to incorporate it more directly in your scholarship? Any and all of these things are areas that you can consider writing about as you're preparing the research and scholarship portion of your diversity statement. Then, once you've considered how you want to talk about it as it pertains to your research and scholarship, then you want to think about mentoring and advising. So have you worked one-on-one in a mentorship or advisory capacity or in a group with individuals who are from marginalized groups? And if so, how did you work with them as it pertained to identifying and overcoming barriers to success? So think about what you've done in terms of mentorship and teaching and advising, any kind of work that you've done that allowed you to engage with students from underrepresented groups in more of a mentorship and an advising role. And if you plan to do that in the future, what will you do? So in terms of recruiting individuals for your research group, right? How are you going to do that in a way that welcomes students from marginalized groups? Are you going to participate in certain conferences and meetings? Are you going to do certain types of outreach? When you outreach from particular schools, what are the ways in which you're going to ensure that you're recruiting students from underrepresented groups? And also, what will you do to retain those students? So for example, here at Stony Brook, we have Simmer mentor training, right? Molly can speak more to that, but essentially this is the gold standard for training as it pertains to having a more inclusive training environment. And so you can even talk about how you could, first and foremost, you can attend the training because it's offered here at Stony Brook, but then you could talk about how you're going to incorporate some of the things you've learned in that training as you're thinking about how you might not only recruit, but retain students from underrepresented groups. And this is really important because oftentimes there's a tremendous focus on how do we bring people in? How do we get more diversity? How do we get more students from underrepresented groups? But enough has not been done as it pertains to retaining those students. What will we do differently to ensure that students who come into a space where they don't see many people that look like them, or they don't see many people who have the same experiences as them, what will we do to ensure that they feel welcome and supported and like they belong in that space? So these are things to think about as you continue to develop your future plans for how mentorship and advising will be impacted by your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Additionally, we talked about teaching, right? And so how do you plan to serve a student body that's diverse in many different ways? And there are many ways to look at this as it pertains to your course design, and what you do to create an atmosphere where everyone feels welcome and everyone feels like they belong. Again, the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching has a number of opportunities for you to learn more about this and find ways to incorporate it. So I won't go too in depth on this, but these are the areas, these are the questions you want to ask yourself as you think about your teaching. Additionally, you want to think about how your approach will facilitate discussion and how you're going to use active learning. We do know that there's empirical evidence of the value of active learning, and how you incorporate that is something that you can talk about, whether it's in your teaching statement or in your diversity statement. How are you going to consider positionality, power, and diversity? For example, are you going to create activities for engagement among students that considers that there's certain students that are more likely to speak up in class, right? There's certain students that are more likely to team up with each other if the students are given the opportunity to form their own groups. So how would you consider these issues as you think about how you would structure your class and how you would structure discussions? Also, does your discipline lend itself to any dialogue about diversity? For example, in engineering, speaking as it pertains to urban planning and how that might impact students from underrepresented groups, if we're talking about more civil engineering, or if we're talking about other areas that lends itself to a dialogue about diversity, then you can incorporate that within teaching. Also, thinking about your course readings and the sources that you're going to be using, are there diverse voices that will be incorporated in your course and in the required readings for your course? Some things like this you want to think about, and how you might diversify and decolonize content for your courses. So all of these things are aspects of your teaching that you can incorporate in the diversity statement. And then ultimately, why do we need to do this in the first place? Ultimately, we know that increasing sense of belonging is embodied in the following 4 goals as derived from a review of inclusion statements across campuses. So we know that it ensures that students from underrepresented populations have the support they need to succeed. It allows for building relationships and developing skills, multicultural skills with members from diverse backgrounds. It enhances students' ability to participate in a pluralistic, interdependent, and global community. And it increases the participations of students of color in campus life. There are many papers, much evidence, overwhelming evidence that this is really important. And anyone who sees themselves as an educator, anyone who sees themselves as someone who will make a difference will need to consider these things if you want to reach all students and not just students who come into the institution with abundant privilege, right? So this is extremely important for us to consider as we move forward as educators, as we move forward in our work. And so that pretty much helps us to really focus on what is important so that we can really serve our students. So time to practice. What is your knowledge and experience with diversity? What has been your experience promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what would you like to do in the future to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? We don't have much time. These are things I want you to think about as you're practicing. So I won't ask you to put anything in the chat. I'd much rather leave a little bit of time just to make sure I'm able to answer any questions that anyone has. So we're gonna stop it here. Let me just make sure that I have everything.
And actually, Carrie, do you mind answering a couple of questions from the chat before we move forward? Or do you want to hold those to the end?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna go ahead and answer the chat questions.
Okay,
now.
great. So we have a few questions from Frankie. The first one is kind of like, who is the first intended audience for the diversity statement? Would it be primarily somebody from inside one's own discipline or from outside?
It would likely be a mix. It'll likely be a mix because of the search committee, depending on that institution. More, I would say more than likely, most will be within the discipline, but it is possible that they have external individuals on there as well. So you do want to be careful as it pertains to jargon and making sure that it would be accessible to individuals who might be outside of the discipline.
And then going back to the point about access to materials and increasing access, the question is, should we be open about wanting to publish via open access or Creative Commons, or could that hurt us if the tool is R1?
That's a good question. By and large, federal funding agencies are requiring that our work be open access. So my recommendation would be that would be fine, especially because the federal agencies are requiring that now across the board. But definitely I would pose that question to someone within the discipline as well, just to get another perspective on it. But that is my perspective from working with both NIH and NSF projects, that they are actually requiring that everything we do is open access right now.
One last question from Frankie, or an additional question from Frankie. Is there a list of badges or certificates that SELT offers related to professional development that work toward DEI? So I can share the link to SELT badges in the chat, but I didn't know if there was anything additional you wanted to speak to there.
No, the same thing that you would share would be good. And then I would just recommend reaching out to Kimberly Bell. And then you can get connected to what is offered through SELT as it pertains to anti-racist pedagogy. All right, do we have any other questions? Don't apologize, Frankie, I love your question. Requirements behind. So that was it, they might be pressured. Are they strategies? So I want to make sure I'm understanding this question correctly. Romeo, can you come off mute for a moment? Are you able to come off mute?
Yes, I can. I'm sitting outside, so I hope like the sounds of nature don't disrupt
Oh, no,
me, but I'm off.
it's good. Can you kind of clarify that question for me? I want to make sure I'm understanding you.
So I'll kind of expand the example a little bit. So let's say that in your diversity statement, you hit all the marks and you show that you're committed to DEI, but you want to fit into the department who's also committed to it, of course. But I'm worried that there are some departments who are under pressure from, say, the administration, which I'm sure is unfortunately probably common throughout the country, right? So they're not necessarily as committed, but they're open to hiring somebody who is, to kind of get the administration off their backs. And then I would, anyone who would be hired to that department would pretty immediately find that it was a bit of a trap. And that's something I'm sure that many of us, me especially, would want to avoid. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And to some degree, there's some aspect of this that you just won't know. But my recommendation would be through the process, you typically get an opportunity to speak with various people. So you'll write your statement, you'll have your stance as it pertains to your interest, your commitment, and your future plans. And once you make it past that first round, typically you're invited into in-person visit to that institution where you'll meet with lots of different people. And my recommendation is the best way to avoid something like that is to really ask the questions and try to determine from the individuals you're meeting with what the true commitment is. And so really asking questions that maybe may not be as direct, because sometimes people will tell you what you really want to hear. But even finding out what, how many other faculty at that institution are from underrepresented groups, what are other people doing there, find out what they're really focused on in terms of what they're giving attention to, what kind of programs they're running, so that you can see whether it's just lip service as it pertains to diversity, or if they're actually putting finances and support behind these efforts. And that, if you see where they're spending their money, it'll tell you whether they're truly committed to it or not.
Okay, that's very brilliant. I'll do that for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right.
We have another question about whether diversity statements should be available publicly online. Should it be something that we include in an online portfolio or a LinkedIn page and make public? And then a follow-up question about what that should look like. Should it just be text or also have visuals and audio as well?
That's really a personal preference as to whether or not to make that available online. And it depends on if that's practice for your particular discipline to have your materials and your information available. It really, as it pertains to making it available, I don't see how that would hurt your application. If this is something that you're really committed to and you stand behind. We know that we're living in a time right now where there's a lot of attack on diversity. And so one thing to consider when making things public is that there may be naysayers, there may be people who are not supportive of these things. And depending on your level of commitment and also your level of comfort as it pertains to putting yourself out there, right? And so if you are comfortable with that and you want to make that available, then it really is a personal choice. I think either way, if this is something that you stand by, then it would not be an issue. And as far as videos and what have you, again, all of those are all personal preferences. All right. I have not had any of my colleagues actually doxxed for their work. But we know that this is real and it does happen. I've seen this happen when there are specific statements that are made where people are doxxed for statements that they make. But not just for doing the work in general, right? But this is definitely a concern, and we've seen even faculty here at Stony Brook experience this, and that's what I was thinking when I was talking about your level of your personal preference and how much you want to put yourself out into the public. Once you put yourself out into the public, it welcomes people to have their opinions and to share those opinions. And sometimes those opinions can be very harmful. And so it really depends on your personal preference as to whether or not you want to make all of your information available, or if you want to reserve it for an as needed basis when you're applying for your jobs. Any other questions? All right, so I think we can end it here. I will provide a list of resources as it pertains to papers that you might want to cite as you're thinking about what you're going to put in your statement. So when the follow-up email goes out, I'll make sure that that would be included in there. So Molly, I'll get that to you guys so that you can include it in the follow-up email after the meeting. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Carrie Ann. That was wonderful. And yes, thank you all for coming. And just again, a quick reminder that the final session in the series will be next Thursday at 11 a.m., same Zoom link. And that one will be on research statements led by Jennifer Albanese of the Writing Center. So have a great day, everyone.